Welcome to the CRM MVP podcast. This is my first time hosting a podcast, so this is Michael Ochs, and Gus has been nice enough to bring out the equipment and give me a chance to actually take the chance to host a podcast with some of my heroes, honestly. We've got Daryl Labar here, we've got Nick Dolman, we've got Jason Latimer, and we've got Andrew Batenko. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and the one thing I want to get from each of you guys, since this is a developer-focused podcast, is what your developer strengths are, and also tell me where you're not good at, or what it is that you guys don't necessarily excel at as developers. So I'm going to start with Daryl.
Hi, Daryl Labar here. Strengths, long walks on the beach. No. I probably the most experienced doing architecture type things, inheritance, setting up things that way, plug-in base classes, all that kind of fun stuff. I like to think of ways how to make things better, more efficient, more automagical. So I enjoyed doing that kind of stuff. Some areas that I am not strong in would definitely be portals. I'm in a single portal thing. So I just learned from whatever I can from Nick and his podcast, so that way I can pretend like I know what I'm talking about if I'm in a meeting where they're talking about portals. So, I haven't actually done anything with Azure either. So I feel like a weakling as far as a developer if I haven't put an Azure function out there or something or other. It's failing in so many ways. That's me.
Cool. I'm Nick Dolman. Follow me on Twitter at ReadyXRM. Also listen on the competing network, Refresh the Cache, with me and Colin Vermander, where we talk about portals and portal development, things like that. Probably my weakness is I haven't done a lot of hands-on hardcore development. I actually had to write a plugin about 2 months ago, and that was the first time after 8 years. Wow. And it was a bit of a struggle. Got it going. So I think in terms of what these guys talk about, I'm almost in the punch card era of they're still called call-outs, right, guys?
No.
So anyways, probably a bit of time. And and I also want to point out, Mike, this is I think the first time Gus has ever given up control of his podcast. So that's pretty cool. So anyways, just moving along to Jason.
I'm Jason Latimer. I make some developer tools you might have seen. I think my other strengths are some of the Azure stuff and just coming up with unique solutions to things, thinking outside the box. And some of my weaknesses would probably be just having to write anything down. The worst thing I ever have to do is write a conference abstract. Those 3 sentences will take me an hour and a half to write. And over to Andrew.
My name is Andrew Batenko, and you can hear that my accent is typical Southern accent, where I'm from, South Carolina, Greenville. What I'm good at, I believe I'm really good in hacking of existing product to make it work the way it should not work, but make it work. What I'm really bad at is almost everything around CRM, like portals, flow, logic apps, so basically the whole Azure stack. Yes, I'm sucks in it.
All right, good. So I think that segues into my next question. So I recently stopped working for a partner. I was a head down developer for about 13 years. And I transitioned into a contract position. And for the last 2 months, I've actually been configuring Dynamics. I've written probably 25 lines of code in those 2 months. And as a developer, that starts to make me feel like my job, may not, or like I've somehow changed positions. And truth is, I honestly think that the citizen developer is starting to come about, and I was actually able to do a proof of concept for a client using just configuration, very little code. What do you guys think about that? What do you think about the citizen developer rising? What do you think about how the no code solutions are coming about? What do you think that means for developers in general? Jason.
Well, I think it sounds good on the surface and everything. I don't think developers should really be, career developers should really be worried all that much. Because as soon as you introduce something, this citizen developer movement, you've got things like Flow and you got Power Apps and people can do all this stuff. People are naturally going to try and push the limits of it right away. And, now you're getting into territory, we need a, career developer to go and fill in the gaps for that, to make our custom connector to do something you can't natively do with those tools. So you're just upping the game all around, I think.
Okay.
You're always going to have integrations to deal with. And Flow does have all these connectors, but sooner or later you'll run into issues with processing time or guaranteed uptime, stuff like that. So there's always going to be dev work that has to be done, even though you do have the citizen developers to fill in the gaps. I mean, it's like the macros back in the day, and someone creates some weird Excel or Word macro that like the company depends on, and then IT gets scared and they say we need to have more control over this, and yeah, so that's always going to be at that stage that. If there's more that citizen developers can do, then that just means there's more time for us to focus on things that are probably more interesting.
What do you think? What do you think, Andrew?
So, from my background, I came from just clear development, and when I thought that consultants will get possibility to do something that we had to do, I thought that we will have no work, and I was kind of shocked about it. But again, like Jason told, when new features are introduced, for consultants, for citizen developers, new features are introduced for regular developers as well. So it's kind of wages. We are going further, and it's really cool.
So what are the opportunities for developers where configuration just won't cut it? Like, what are the scenarios? So I was in the contract that I was in, there was a specific scenario, and it was so they had a model whereby you entered a number into a form, and it had to create a number, the same number of records associated with that record. So you had to create 3 records if they entered the number 3. You had to create 4 records if they entered the number 4. You can't do that with workflows, right? You can't do that with a flow. So
we can do it with Flow.
Oh, well, maybe you can do it with Flow. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and you may be able to do it with your workflow extensions as well. I'm not sure. But, so what are the scenarios, though, that you've come up against where you can't do something without writing code? Integration, Daryl mentioned that. Obviously, integration, there are certain integration scenarios where you're just not going to be able to do it with the out-of-the-box. But what are some other...
anything that's going to take a fair amount of time. Again, you've got the scenario where, what if the person types in 100, 200, 1,000? What if they create 1,000 tasks?
Right.
I should say one of the interview questions I ask people, like how would you CRM online? How would you create 1,000 tasks? And everybody's gonna come back and say, we'll just make an asynchronous workflow. No, it's not gonna do it, I'm afraid. Even if they said, we'll just outsource it to some zoo animals or something, I would have accepted that as a valid answer. But that's the biggest one. Everybody tries to cram too much stuff into that 2 minutes, and you're gonna run into problems eventually.
Okay.
Yeah, that was one project I worked on recently. That was sort of if we were going to touch 100+ records, then it'd be, it was an online system. We were going to actually move to the Azure Service Bus or Azure Functions, just because we knew we'd start exceeding that 2-minute limit on plugins. So I think that, Jason, that's what you're referring to, the 2-minute sandbox processing. Right. So I think there's always going to be that last mile to complete a lot of these projects. We need to bring in developers. what I kind of worry about with the citizen developer is there needs to be an ALM process for the citizen developer to stop the Johns and Peters of the world, and we want to actually add some functionality to our quote module, and we're going to create some business rules, or we're going to create a flow around that, but they're just going to dive right into production because that's how they've been doing their production spreadsheets for the last 10, 20 years.
Yeah, and you're kind of getting ahead of me because that was one of my questions.
Stop doing that.
I would love to hear from all of you about how you manage application lifecycle, and particularly like one of the things that I've always had an issue with is how do I structure my GitHub repos? Like if I've got a solution, I've got code that has a plugin, I've got web resources.
GitHub.
What's that?
Don't use GitHub.
Well, how do I
Azure DevOps repos.
Right. How do I structure those in a uniform way? And that's always something that I wasn't sure, like if you guys had best practices, obviously I know that some of you have some of that built into your add-ons and things like that, but jumping ahead, I guess, any thoughts on that?
I would recommend go and check if you haven't checked it yet. How it's called? This framework, Xrem CI framework. It basically resolves all your problems.
Okay.
Have you seen it?
No, I haven't.
Okay, you should, because for us, for big customers, we usually use Xrem CI framework from Weil Hamza. This is a really smart developer from Europe, and he created that framework that helped us to resolve almost all the ALM problems. So just imagine that everything that you are using, that you are customizing, plugins, scripts, customizations, even data, you can put inside VSTS and move from one environment with check-ins, with builds to other environment. Check that it's valid, and if you really want it, just with single click, deploy it to production, to UAT, to test. So basically, anywhere you want.
And I'm aware of those tools too, like the Xrem CI framework, and then I know Colin Vermander's working on. They have a bunch of scripts that they use where he works as well. But the amount there is a certain amount of investment in time to set that up for an enterprise project. Totally makes sense. Totally, the return on investment, the insurance and stuff is there. But I'm kind of, thinking with these, citizen developers, there is no good ALM story for the small customer, the 20 users. Yet, exactly. They have their sandbox instance, they have their production instance. They add some field, if they are trying to follow a good process, they're doing, they're, adding the fields to the forms, and maybe doing some JavaScript, maybe a plugin if they're getting that sophisticated. But then they'll export that as a solution and they'll import it into their production, and they're actually using their sandbox as their code repository, which is not great, but how much effort it is to set up a proper DevOps for that small customer. And that's where I think there's a bit of a gap in the solutioning there.
So why do you guys say don't use GitHub? So if we wanted to put out an open source project, where would you, we're going to put it out on GitHub. How are we going to, structure that? And I think that's one of the things that I've had problems with is getting a standard for, you've got a solution, you've got a plugin, you've got a web resource.
Are you just asking how do you actually structure the .NET solution, or are you asking how do you structure the application, the automated deployment and building and all that kind of stuff?
I think it's just structuring the solution itself.
Okay. I have an example project that I go through and define how I structure the solution that I use. It's the Xrem unit test example on GitHub. It goes through and shows. I use a combination of both shared projects as well as NuGet only source projects, and to be able to bring in the bits and pieces that I need in a way that doesn't require me to use IO merge as well. So that's why I usually do that. I usually have a shared project that contains all my early bound entities and any plugin base classes, anything I want to use among any plugin that I have, and then I'll have another a shared test project and a regular test project that contains all my unit testing stuff that I need to be shared, and then I have separate plugin projects and separate unit test projects outside of that, but they all depend on a single core place.
Stuff gets kind of complicated, especially in figuring like automated builds and things like that. If you have like one solution, multiple projects, but you're separating your solutions, say like by line of business or something, and you've got one plugin in each. It gets kind of dicey when you're trying to set up builds like that sometimes. You're trying to build one project and ship one of the DLLs, and like I said, the real answer is there's no good solution until someone at Microsoft I think is put something good together. So it should really just be a point and click.
Or maybe we should put something good together.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the onus really is kind of on Microsoft to put something out. They want, they preach good ALM across the board, and they want you to use managed solutions. The only way managed solutions really work is if you follow, adhere to an ALM process like 100% all the time, and then even still maybe not. But it's got to, for people to adopt it, it's got to be just stupid simple. You've got to be able to like push the button, and it's got to just do it.
Yeah.
And it can't be any harder than that.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's what I've been, we had that discussion about managed versus unmanaged, and it's like, regardless of what side of the fence you're on, if you are using managed, you need that strong ALM process. And I think that's kind of hard to follow where, the engineers at Microsoft, they're living and breathing a source control solution management every day. So it just comes natural to them to roll that out to a customer.
But are they? So how are they?
Okay, maybe I'm being naive.
So how are they? So if the sales module and the service module is now a solution,
a first party app,
right? How are they managing that, internally? And are we not getting the full story on like how they're managing? Because imagine you've got some customizations, you've got some workflows, you've got some processes that you built. How are they managing those solutions? Are they blowing them out into?
Well, they can also have, what Microsoft will tell you, a certain person we all know will tell you that, each developer should have one instance, which is, I perfectly agree with, but when you're paying $550 per month per instance,
right,
and you got 15 developers on your program, nobody's going to pay for that. It's the idea is there, but we need to make the instances cheaper. The idea of rebuilding your instance from source control is, I totally agree with, and source control should be the source of truth, but it's just too expensive and just too prohibitive right now.
Yeah.
And it's hard to justify. And again, it's hard to justify something like, well, yes, we should be building for our dev a brand new dev instance, spinning up a new instance, loading the data, which is tricky, and then loading the customization and configuration. And how many cycles does that take? And we're talking consulting, we're talking billable time, where I can press a button and 2 minutes later have a copy of a production in my sandbox.
Yeah.
And that's where maybe that's not the right way to do it, but that's the economical way to do it. And you got to sell that to people that are selling projects where budgets sometimes are very tight, the hours are tight, you want to, and also competitive as well. So I think this is sort of there's the good way, but then there's also that time investment, which I think Microsoft kind of misses the mark on a little bit.
It's the realism of it, right?
Yeah.
It's not that the place doesn't have money.
Yeah.
These places we work with, they've got millions, billions of dollars, but the fact that they think, well, that should just be included with what we're paying for.
Yeah.
Well, they say, here's how you can do it, but they're not necessarily looking at the real deal. So I have a question, and this question was intended actually for Aiden was supposed to be here. Aiden's not here.
He chickened out.
Yeah, he chickened out. He went to bed. So I'm going to direct this question at Andrew, and I'm going to ask him, what is the best workflow extension library that's out there?
That's a tricky question because I have my own. Yes, and
but that's an easy answer then.
This is not the answer. I'm not insisting this is the best one.
Isn't it Damien's?
It scrolls for like 2 screens.
Yeah. So I would say that my toolkit it's a good one. But sometimes my toolkit doesn't cover tasks that I need to implement. So in these situations, I'm using JSON tools for the workflows because he has a lot of cool, wonderful stuff inside. I will not lie, I have never used Aiden's toolkit, so I cannot tell. I know what it has inside, but I had no scenarios when I was not able to do something with workflows using my toolkit or Jason's toolkit.
I didn't even realize that Jason had a toolkit.
He has toolkits.
I saw your string manipulation.
Strings and dates and numbers and
because
attachments, and I can't even remember them all now.
Oh my!
And regex much more. Yes.
Cool. So that was. We'll finish up that question. Anybody else want to?
I would say
follow up on that?
just not wanting to segue back, but no one did answer why not to use GitHub.
Well, I said I use it for my own stuff.
Okay.
They do have
I
private
use it
repos
as well,
now.
but the huge gap is the auto builds, like
Thanks, the
build
automated buildings
agents,
question.
etc.
Okay.
But after acquisition of GitHub by Microsoft, I expect that something will change there. Maybe they will. I don't know. It's just assumption. Maybe they will bring some cool stuff from VSTS to GitHub. I just assume.
Or actually, you could just use Azure DevOps to build your GitHub repos because they give you like 10 concurrent build pipelines for free.
So can you share like open source on VSTS on Visual Studio Online?
Yes, you can. You can make a public project.
Okay. Does anybody ever look at that?
Yes.
Okay. That's
Someone must, otherwise they went to. Well, I shouldn't say
Sorry,
that.
I'm not going to. I was just like, because I was curious. Because wait a minute, we never answered that question. So sorry to derail you.
All right. So the next question I had was this was a legit question, and I think
Those other ones weren't.
and I think the people on this podcast in particular will be able to answer these questions. So, best practices, worst practices, worst thing you've ever seen, code wise, and
Oh boy,
I know
Daryl's got some doozies.
I know Daryl's got. Yeah, that's what I was hoping to hear. Daryl's.
I actually
input on
started
this.
an internal site that was dedicated to bad code that we've seen at clients.
Client side or
yeah.
server side or
The worst code I ever had to go look at was a PLSQL statement that was 16,000 lines long, of which about a quarter of it was just copy paste with like a couple things changed. And so trying to figure out what had changed, what it was, and I had to convert that all to C#. It was, that was horrible. Most of the stuff is just simple stuff of, don't if else yourself 15 lines in when it could just be a switch statement, like simple things like that, or don't, and it just, there's so much I can't even begin.
Well, tell me, you're a client side, you're a kind of a JavaScript guru, as it were. At least in my eyes,
okay, all right,
because I don't know.
Just because I know promises and async, that's why.
So tell us about that.
That's
tell
why
us
I'm a
about
guru in JavaScript and TypeScript.
how we should be writing JavaScript.
You should be writing in TypeScript. That's what you should be doing. No, I really liked when I'm using TypeScript and using JavaScript on a CRM project is using module loaders to load the modules rather than using the built-in JavaScript support within CRM. That way I can define in my file what all its dependencies are, and then it just goes and automatically loads them all from CRM for me. So the only thing I do is wire up the onload method, and that's it. From there, at the onload method, I say, this is the file I want you to go load. It loads the file and loads all the dependencies, and so I don't have to go through and specify. If I add a new file, I don't have to go and update 15 different forms. And I know it's supported now in V9, but even you still potentially have some issues every now and then too. So, yeah.
What about server side? Anybody have any best practices? Anything that you've seen that's been done horribly?
Well, I've seen I think we've all seen the on-prem situation where you look at the SQL database and there's all these triggers and stored procs and stuff that are custom on the CRM database. Now, that's a big benefit of online because you can't even do that. So, to me, I'm a big proponent of pull the plug on-prem. I mean, nobody should ever buy a server again. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I see, and there's not really a good way to get around it sometimes, is people they'll make one plugin on something, then it'll turn into 2, and they'll have some workflows, and then all of a sudden 5 plugins, and it starts to creep up over time. And all of a sudden, you're running into this 2-minute, sandbox timeout limit because this plugin's triggering this other plugin, which is triggering this workflow, which is triggering that other plugin, which is now coming back and triggering itself again.
Yeah.
And just, there's not really a good way to manage that. Though.
Recursive. I've seen bad recursive.
Well, I've noticed that too. It's like once you open the plugin box, once you start writing code, then why would you do anything else? Like it's almost like once an implementation starts to write code, then it's
like at some point
from there on.
You have to stop and kind of regroup a little bit and
Right.
look at what you've written, and they say technical debt. And that's kind of technical debt right there. You need to stop and evaluate what you've written and kind of maybe consolidate some of that or eliminate it if you don't need it anymore. You can't just keep adding and adding and adding because you're going to run into problems.
System.
I was on a recent project where they had 4 different plugin base classes that they were using. So they didn't have one standard; they had 4 different ones. It was, and they did different things by default differently. And so maybe you were using the actual admin service, maybe you were using the user service. You didn't know. You had to make sure you knew what plugin base you were working with. So that's my one big thing I always hark on is making sure there is at least a plugin base class so you can apply changes globally.
The worst thing that I've seen is when people were trying to implement things that should be implemented on the server side using the client side approach and the vice versa.
Yeah.
That's the worst thing that I've seen, except the SQL Server manipulations, because I still remember those things when I was trying to import something, solution failed, and I discovered that some smart guy used calculated field, so he just tweaked the table to use instead of standards. He converted the standard field to calculated field on the SQL level that basically completely failed, tried to apply change to table from CRM itself.
Well, I think that's a good point too. It's understanding when it's best to use a pre-plugin versus a post-plugin versus a workflow versus a action versus So what are, in your opinion, if anybody wants to answer this question, so why would you use a plugin versus a workflow versus an action? I think that's an important question for developers as well as end users, knowing when the appropriate time is to use those.
Well, you're going to use an action whenever you have anything that you're going to want to kind of wrap up in one little call. Most of the time, that's a JavaScript call calling into the server to do something custom that is in a normal operation,
Or an external
thing calling in. Yes,
when you have the plugin on it, even.
Yep. Yeah, so and that's where actions would come into play. Plugins would come into play versus workflows. I tend to just always default to plugins just because you have a little more control over what's going on in the pipeline, a little more control of what the previous values were, and being able to control it that way. But if it's something that the citizen developer, the non-developer is going to be working on the workflow, then that's when you want to look at the custom workflow activity that they'd be able to plug in there if they need to. So.
I think just actions in general are probably like one of the best things that they've ever come up with. I mean, really, I remember teaching a training class once, and people were like mocking actions, and I thought, like, oh, that's silly.
That was the best, though.
Because, I mean, it takes the concepts you know how to do a workflow, so that whole UI is totally familiar to everybody.
Right.
You know how to do a plugin, which can be applied to an action. Everybody knows that already. Now you just got this thing that just merges them together. Like, how is that not like just perfect?
Have we not gone through and done our own custom actions before they were a thing by creating a custom entity and doing a retrieve? You had to do a retrieve,
Yeah.
and that would get your parameters in, and then you do whatever you do and still put it back in the response.
That's how we hack some Portal code actually now, because we can't write unless we do a form submit.
You kind of get to embrace the ugliness of it all. Totally supported. Oh, it's ugly. It's up Andrew's way, right? Hacking it, make it work.
This is where Jonas right now on the other side of the ocean is like spinning in his bed right now, hearing this talk.
Yeah, did I mention that we're at Boston 365 Saturday? I did not. So that's why we're all here. So in the middle of the show.
Aren't you kind of in charge of that thing?
I am.
Yeah.
All right. So
you can learn to toot your own horn.
I helped organize it, and here we are with some of the brightest minds in Dynamics. So,
Where?
you guys.
Well, Gus is sitting over there.
Oh, yeah, there he is. He's in the corner.
There we go. That's what.
So this is.
He's talking into a potato. That's why you can't hear him.
He brought the equipment. Daryl brought the questions. So Daryl wanted to do a worst solution lightning round, and I think that we should do that right now. I think that would be fun. What do you think? Sound good?
What are the rules?
I don't know. There's no rules. We're just gonna decide what the worst solution is or the best solution.
The worst solution we've done ourselves that
Nah.
we're kind of embarrassed, like baby picture kind of thing, or ones we've seen.
Okay.
Or just kind of you're off the top of your head. What would be the best way to implement this?
Here's one. Let's
or
say
the worst way to implement.
you want
this.
to implement a clone functionality
Exactly.
on a entity, but it has over 200 child records that also need to get cloned. And you want the user to be able to trigger that from the UI.
How would you implement that?
I'll tell you how I implemented it. As nasty as it was to actually batch them up into groups of 10 and send 10 requests at a time up to the server and pray that they never they never exited out of the browser or pushed the back button, because that would kill the whole transaction.
did it all.
So the client actually loved it because they got a little feedback. Oh, it's 10 of 20, it's 10 of 30. Yeah. And then they started using the out-of-box clone, a different one, and it didn't do the same thing. Like, hey, why doesn't this do the same thing? We want the other one. And I was like, oh, no, you don't. You don't really want the other one. That just, yeah. So I had hopes that like putting in some extra logic to say, is it finished cloning or not? And then cleaning it up later, and never got to it. So
Wasn't this the same customer that did their metrics on form mode, like 1,000, 2,000, 3,000?
I don't remember. I think it was.
That's actually, but that's not a bad solution to that problem, right? You've got a long-running process. The only way you can do it within Dynamics 365, you can't do it in a workflow. You can't do it in a plugin. You can feed it off to an Azure service, but the only way you can actually do it is to have a page sitting
They
there.
were on-prem too, and they didn't allow access to their site. So
No, theoretically that's possible, to be honest.
What?
Cloning like this long running operation, but again, you have somehow internally to implement this paging. For example, you are doing recursive workflow, but we are hitting the limit of recursive operation.
Right, but you almost have to have an interactive page in order to run a process more than 2 minutes, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it might be. You have to have an interactive page that you're.
And sometimes it would take 6 minutes to go through and do the clone, but as long as they were seeing it updated, the user is fine.
All right, so here's the next one. So, and this one was also asked by you. So, how would you implement your own auto numbering solution, and what would be the best way to do it?
Oh, wow.
Because I have an idea for this, and I had an idea, and it was never implemented. Somebody went out and like did a SQL solution for it. So check this out. Here's what I'm thinking. So each of the transactions, or every time you retrieve a record in Dynamics, it happens within a transaction. So I'm thinking if you wrote a record that was, say, this is, the semaphore for I'm locking this particular record. So on retrieve of your auto number record, you write a record that says, I'm locking this. Now, if that transaction fails, it would roll that back, right? So that record that I wrote would get rolled back. But anybody that came in afterwards could check to see if that record exists. And that would work regardless of whether you're running it on a single instance or you're running it on multiple instances. And that plugin would actually be able to do a true...
There's a white paper on this.
Yeah.
That defines the pattern you're supposed to use. It's to the effect of that, where you're retrieving the next number and writing to it, keeping the transaction open.
Right.
Incrementing your number, then writing it back. And that Microsoft has a white paper on this.
Okay. So that was my solution. But
Why wouldn't we just use the out-of-the-box auto numbering now?
I don't know. Come on, Nick.
So
Because it doesn't do what you need.
does a new one do custom entities, or is it still just on the standard out of the box ones?
I think
it does custom. It does whatever.
It does whatever.
There's just no UI for it.
Except for
you have
the
to-
XRM toolbox.
I should say there's no Microsoft-based UI. There is the XRM Toolbox one.
We're just talking theoretically, really.
No, but one of the limitations of it is if you want to add an auto number to an entity after it's been created. So
You can't do that?
no.
Oh.
Yeah,
well,
but
you can, but it's not as clear cut as.
yeah. Anyway, this number is stored somewhere, so the only way is to find where it's stored and tweak it.
Yeah.
All right, so next one. How would you implement a solution to sync two instances of Dynamics? On creative record in one instance, it gets synced to another instance on delete.
Oh, I just did this.
Did you?
I did.
Tell us, Jason, what did you do?
Well, we're using just the service bus queue is using the out-of-the-box integration to the push to the queue as a .NET binary, and then we have a function. We have a couple functions reading. Queue is for each side going out, and corresponding functions are essentially the same logic in them, but each watching a queue, and then it's parsing out it's getting the remote execution context object and looking at what change, if it's a create or an update or delete, and we've got some specific mappings between the two environments because it's not necessarily a one-to-one. Some fields were consolidated in the new instance. It's checking some mapping. We're trying to use some like Azure storage to kind of reduce the amount of lookups it has to do for things like users and stuff that don't change relatively often.
How do you keep
keeping everything in Key Vault?
So is that plugins that are firing when
it's using the out of the box? So technically, yes, it's essentially a plugin, but it's no code to get the output out. It's just configure the service, the queue endpoint, and just register what messages you want it to fire on. And
how do you handle updates, triggering updates, or not triggering updates?
That we're still working through, but I think we're going to end up doing using deferring the message, and then we'll have to write it out somewhere that we ran into a situation where we've had an update come through before create, and then have to go back and use it like the correlation ID or something to figure out which one is still sitting out there that we pushed back into the queue.
Okay.
Because the function's not going to pick it up again, I don't think, at that point.
So,
but it's a tricky situation because you can have that scenario where an update comes in before create.
So Jason just completely destroyed that question. I thought it would be actually a conversation, but he knew how to solve it.
Well, I was on this yesterday.
All right. So I got a question. I guess this one's for Daryl. What is the best unit testing framework?
Well, as we all know, we should be using early binding. And because we should be using early binding, then the XRM unit test is the way to go. Actually, just this week, I went through and actually started to create a chart showing the differences between the frameworks. Because obviously, I don't have the experience with Fake XRM Easy or the one from Delegatus. I don't remember that one off the top of my head right now. But it's kind of funny where they all sit. Really, the Fake XRM Easy is all about doing local development, local testing. It doesn't really provide a lot if you ever want to switch between local and hitting the server. My framework, the XRM unit test, really is about being able to do tests locally and test it with a fake CRM instance, or to test against a real live version of CRM and have everything get cleaned up automatically and everything get mapped automatically and all that kind of fun stuff. So at the core, they're very similar with that fake iOrization service, but I add a lot more stuff on that's not related to that in the way that it auto-generates your entities and even maps them. So I have a concept of a environment builder where you just give it entities and you can say, hey, they're related. And you don't have to tell what the actual attribute is that they're related on. You say, hey, this is a parent to these 4 child records, and it'll automatically add those and associate it correctly based on the relationships in your early bound entities and create it in the correct order. And if there's a circular reference, it'll even create both and then update them later with the circular references.
Delete them as well.
Yes, and then it deletes automatically as well.
Nice.
So yeah, you just have to define the GUID. That's it.
Well, that sounds like the best unit testing framework to me.
Yeah, no.
Jordy's not here to defend himself.
Yes. No.
All right. So I was expecting to have Jim here too. Jim and Aiden both bailed on us.
But you got me instead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's gotta be
Jason,
something.
have you been on a podcast before?
Nope.
Oh,
Never?
nice.
This is your virgin podcast experience?
It is.
This is my version presenter or host. Nice.
Wow.
That's awesome.
Because I was just thinking, I'm not sure if I ever heard you on a podcast, so that's cool.
All right. So,
Totally derailing. Sorry.
I'm starting to run
I'm
out of
sleep
questions.
deprived.
All right. So, best developer XRM toolbox tool. Anyone.
Best developer XRM toolbox tool?
Yeah.
As much as I don't want it to keep his head swelling,
Yeah,
but
say
Fetch
Fetch
XML
XML.
Builder is something I use almost at least a few times a week.
Yeah.
Now I use some of the portal tools as well, but that's just because that's what I do. But overall, like if you're developing, reports, and then even on the portal side too, where you're doing some Fetch XML and Liquid, it's like anytime I see somebody opening Advanced Find and going to the download Fetch XML, I'm like, whoa, stop right there what you're doing. Let me show you something that's going to make your life 1,000 times better.
Yeah. Yeah. I discovered one, which was CRM Chart Guy. So the Power BI Fetch XML generator that he and somebody else actually built is amazing. So the ability to actually, bring in, build Fetch XML for Power BI and build up queries that have, the status code names, that have the pick list names, that have the lookup names, as opposed to just the IDs and things like that. That thing's amazing. So I've been very impressed by that, and that's saved me a lot of time.
I think my vote goes out to the Web Resource Manager, just because having to do that out of the box is horrible. Just the ease to be able to switch back and forth, to push up whatever you want to push up, and to be able to see what's in there and pull it out. It just makes it really,
So
really
that's
nice
a
to
good
do that.
that's a good segue. So what is the best Visual Studio plugin for Dynamics 365? And I think this question goes to Jason.
No. I can answer.
This is
I
all
can-
softballs here, isn't it? There's a lot of softballs.
I can
Softball here,
tell that the best extension for the Visual Studio that is related to Dynamics is Dynamics 365 developer tool. I'm sorry. The Dynamics 365 developer tools from Jason Latimer.
Yeah.
The best one, definitely.
I'm probably gonna stop doing it though soon. So
Are you? You're gonna give it up?
I think so.
Yeah, I mean,
It's too much to keep up. It's too hard. Microsoft should just do it.
yeah,
I told them as much.
it's amazing. I mean, the ability to explode solutions, the ability to publish web resources, publish plugins. That's one of the reasons that I was really honored to have you on the show, Jason. But that's unfortunate if you're going to give it up.
I think so. I think it needs to go away.
It's a lot of work.
It just doesn't get a lot of people I think use it. Just doesn't get the traction
Right.
to help develop it. This is kind of what it comes down to, and it's just I don't have the time.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
Jason, to be honest, just developers are not that mature to understand the value they are getting from that plugin.
Yeah.
Well, we could also have a podcast on community tools, and you saw the soapbox I went on last summer too, when
Yeah.
people were saying, well, these should be free. It's like,
wait a minute, it is free.
well, no, they are free, but I mean, that goes into the whole donations thing and showing some credit. And, you guys are asking too about doing pull requests, that no one does that, or
Right.
that kind of thing. But, I mean, that's a whole other topic.
I did appreciate the 500 new Taiwanese dollars, which I thought when I saw that email coming, I thought it was $500 US. And I was like, yes. Then it was like $15 US. But I still appreciate it nonetheless. It just
All right.
not what I expected.
All right. So everybody
Currency
go
translation
donate.
came out.
Everybody, this lesson that we've learned. Everybody go donate to Jason because
Donate pull requests. I don't need money. I'd rather have someone help with the code, honestly.
yeah.
Yeah, or the documentation. That's me.
There's
Someone do my
documentation for some.
for anything I've done. Yes.
Show your appreciation.
Come on, smart
for these
developers
tools.
can figure out to even without documentation.
All right, guys. I think, are we ready to wrap up? All right. So thank you. This is my first attempt at hosting a podcast. Thank you guys for being such an awesome group, and I think I'm looking forward to doing another one of these in the future, maybe tomorrow. Who knows?
Right. If this was a true Gus podcast, you would say these are the top 10 developer tips from Mike Ochs. But
these are the top 10 developer tips from Mike Ochs.
Perfect.
Should I say it like that? All right, guys.